Dublin.
You are tuned into Sound Science with me, your host, Dr. Yewande Pearse, wishing you a very happy new year. Although having said that, I don't know how you're feeling, but 2020 and 2021 are feeling a little blended to me still, but hopefully they'll begin to separate as things get better and we can truly leave last year behind us. The new year is a time to, as the saying goes, turn over a new leaf. So with a hopeful spirit, I decided to dedicate the first episode of the year to plants. We literally cannot live without plants. Life on Earth depends on them, yet we take them so much for granted. To encourage us to live more in harmony with the plants we encounter and inspire a little more appreciation, I will be talking to three amazing artists, Alexander Kaye, Yuan Zhang, and Adrianda, about their relationship to plants as subjects and how their practices hope to encourage us to treat plants more like kin. I'm not going to say much more as there's a lot to fit into this episode, but I will apologise now for a few sound hiccups during my interview with Alice and Alex. We were all recording from home, which is always an adventure in audio production, so please bear with us. To kick us off, I thought I'd treat you to this find, A Chant for Your Plants featuring Anne Chase, artist, author, lecturer, researcher in noetic science, and graduate of the Cosmic University, which is actually a thing. I googled it. It's very strange, yet extremely compelling.
What tranquility a quiet life affords. I am listening to my thoughts. They sound like a rhapsody in green. My thoughts are with you, dear plants. You are such wonders to me. We are beings living here on Earth together, breathing the same air, feeling contact with the soil. We toil and spin the fabric of living matter. We are one in the shadow of God. Your majestic silence alone is worthy to be heard. A sense of want is a prayer. A vision of the quest is the quest itself. Since prayers are answered, we will pray. With the unfolding of our souls, we shall reach the true meaning of enlightenment. Let us listen to the voice of nature. A consciousness shines on all creatures that has been handed down from one to another. Seeing you change through the days of my life, you teach me a lesson of strength and endurance, serenity and repose. I know the nature spirits are busy helping you grow, evolving in joy, like the stirrings of the atoms inside you, my plants. You take from silence the strength for a new day. With each rising of the sun, you observe the hours of the...
Yuan Zhang is a mixed reality artist, designer, and program organizer. Her work bridges the sacredness of natural environments with the speculative power of human-made ones. inviting exploration into interspecies empathy, generative networks, and the illusion of agency. She's the co-organizer of Virtual Care Lab, a current resident artist at CultureHub, and an involved member of NAVEL. Alice studied at the University of California, Berkeley. Alexander Kaye is an artist born near Detroit, Michigan, and currently residing in Los Angeles, California. His practice began in writing and producing music, and has since expanded into sound and visual art. He creates experimental music with modular synthesis, field recordings, audio manipulation, chants, and aleatoric technique, and traditional instrumentation. Often finding creative guidance through random operations, he embraces unknown variables as part of the process that influences all of his work. Alice and Alex, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. Welcome to Sound Science.
Hello.
Hi, it's so good to finally be here and to chat about the project.
I'm so excited. So where are you both calling in from today?
Yeah, I was in LA, in Highland Park with Alice until very recently. I moved back to where my hometown is of Detroit, but just for the winter. So I will be back on the West Coast with you all, hopefully very, very soon.
Yeah, and I am based on Tomba, Chumash, and Kijland here in Los Angeles, and specifically in Highland Park. And I recently moved here, or I should say moved back. I grew up in suburban LA for a few years, and I moved back to LA more central at the end of last year.
Awesome. So I'm actually really excited to talk about this project because it's very much about the land that we inhabit right now, 2020. And so the project that you have worked on together is called Requiem for Lost Plants, and it was commissioned by Cream Cake Berlin and Naval Los Angeles for the 3HG Festival. So it's an immersive web-based project which aims to resurrect ecological communities that have been uprooted and displaced by colonization and urbanization. To me, I really feel like this project is very defiant, but also incredibly romantic. So my first question is, what was the inspiration behind Requiem for Lost Plants, and how did you end up working together on this commission?
Yeah, so Requiem for Lost Plants is truly inspired by an alternative ecological lens on the land and an indigenous lens specifically through the plants here. And Alex and I actually met through the Naval Assemblies program through the Digital Materialities Assembly that I had the pleasure of facilitating earlier this year. And through that, we had been exploring various themes of how digital matter can represent or distort or otherwise play with some of the, themes of our general lives. It is virtual, but it is also real life, and so some themes like memory and preservation, and other ways of storytelling. And at the time, we were brainstorming something along the lines of for Lost Plans more generally in the virtual reality medium, and then eventually pivoted toward web and augmented reality, and got more honed into the idea that we currently are presenting with the project through a more specific prompts that came by way of Cream Cake and the 3HD Festival.
Yeah, Alice had when we did the digital materials together, and it was such an interesting experience for me. Like I was just starting to get involved in some virtual reality designing myself, and I heard about Naval, and I went and was kind of trying to choose between one of the assemblies, and Alice's just seemed so poignant for like, where my head was at the time. And then yeah, through that we got to know each other. But what was really cool was, I mean, I was really stoked when Alice hit me up, and I don't know if I told you about the Alice or not, but you were listening to some ambient albums that I was doing.
Yeah, Temporary
Yeah,
Castle is really
Temporary
great. And I was like,
Castle.
let's
Yeah.
collaborate. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was stoked because Alice's artwork, I mean, even before this project is so cool, and I'm like really was already in love with her aesthetic, so it was pretty cool. I know we were both like kind of pumped to start working on something together.
Yeah, definitely.
That's awesome. I love how you were able to come together as part of the assembly program at NAVEL. NAVEL is obviously really close to my heart from being involved in it, and create this project. And I mean, I've looked at both of your work separately, and I too am a big fan of both of the work that you make. And bringing that together in this project, I think really hits a lot of different intersections and is so relevant to the LA landscape and the LA space and how we live in LA, but also applicable to so many cities. Web-based visitors find themselves in an anthropocentric representation of LA in the presence of 5 ancestral plants. I know you worked with Parker Davis at Hahomunga Native Plant Nursery, Sophie Katz at UCLA Botanical Garden, and Mike Perron at the Auburn Center to gain a deep ecological perspective. Could you share with the audience what those plants are and what led you to choose them specifically?
Yeah, so the 5 plants that we have chosen are representative of whole communities of ecology, and we have various types of ecological communities around Los Angeles. So wetlands, sand dunes, by the beach, chaparral, and coastal sage scrub habitats, among others. And so we were only able to choose a few due to truly just the amount of time that we had to create the project. But, we of course want to note that there are so many
Yeah.
plants, and even these plants that we have chosen are so connected with other species that might or might not be here anymore due to the displacement of these plants. Yeah, and it's a whole network, it's a whole kind of mutual aid system that is working out there. And so the 5 plants are the Gadingi's black willow, the sacred white sage, the desert globe mallow, the California everlasting, and the beach laya. And each one has a particular story that we found was really empathy evoking and also represented some of the principles that we really love in nature, like generosity or reciprocity. And yeah, and those principles we had been kind of getting to know ourselves, Alex and I, through Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, among other texts that we had been exploring.
That's really beautiful.
Yeah, I think throughout the process of us choosing these plants and kind of, again, like honing in the concept a little more over time, um, a lot of things came into play. I mean, one of the early influences that we were kind of brainstorming together and everything was just well, not even the concept, but the factual thing of mycelia networks underground, basically underneath these plants. It's really, really astounding. I don't know if anyone listening hasn't really done any like deep dive on like mycelium networks. It's actually insane.
It's just like
Yeah.
the brain, but underground in plants and the way they communicate. It's incredible.
Yeah, it is really, it's really, really otherworldly, but it's cool because I mean, it's right here. And it seems like as a society, maybe in the past, I don't know, 20 years or so, but it's specifically really the past 5 or 10, we've been really starting to learn a lot more about these underground networks. And yeah, some of the things that these plants are doing in terms of communicating with each other through these networks of basically mycelia fiber is amazing. And when we were choosing some of these plants, like for instance, the black willow, just knowing that that was like a larger plant in the area, being like a larger tree, for me, I almost started to see the root systems that it has underground, even though we can't really see it, but you start to get a sense of how important these plants are in their own ecological spheres, and just trying to like kind of just wrap our human brains around that was really interesting because it's not something you normally think about.
It's so incredible. And I know with your background with music, the sonification of mycelium, have you explored that at all?
Yeah, definitely. Actually, ironically, the same plant that we were just talking about was one of the ones that I really specifically tried to put a good amount of thought into how to represent its mycelia networks. Again, being such a large plant in the area, it does have a large impact on the nutrient system around it. And yeah, not to get too extremely esoteric audio, but yeah, I mean, if you get a chance to experience the project or hear any of the audio, that plant in particular has a very I don't know the right word to describe it, but it almost sounds like nutrients or data being passed through roots. In my mind, it's not a very pretty sound, so to speak. It's not. I tried to make it not very human, not put too much of my human musical instincts in it, but it just. To me, that's what it would sound like if a plant was kind of like sending out nutrient
It's kind
messages
of
to everything
out of
around it.
like the packages and the loops and it feels like the electronic currents go
Mm-hmm.
sort of exchange underground, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that was at least the intention.
Moving into the actual experience, I've done it a few times, and the whole experience is hard to describe over the radio. So I just urge the audience to log on, and then the details will be on our website. But when I did it myself, I just found like the visuals, the music together, it's just such a perfect union, and it really brings you into this experience. When I was on the filter as well, I think I went on late at night and I was just in bed in my room, and it's actually quite a meditative environment to be in. And when I went onto the platform, I loved reading about each of the plants and their significance, especially from a healing perspective, which is something that I'm also interested in. And what I found amazing about the experience is how much empathy you really feel for these plants when you use the filters, and with the sound and experience together. So, I mean, by sharing space with them, it creates a relationship and then a sense of loss, I found, when you're confronted with their real life absence. So when I was lying in bed in this other world and then came out of it, it just sort of left me feeling kind of like a little bit depressed, like thinking about the fact that these plant species are, no longer with us. So I wonder which of the plants you most relate to.
Yeah, it's really interesting. We've gotten to know all five of these plants like pretty well, more than I've ever known about any plants in my life for sure, which is really cool. When you start to do deep research on these things, you don't only learn about their ecological characteristics, but also I don't know, they're more poetic characteristics, for lack of a better word. Like, for instance, I mean, my favorite, I don't know if this is your favorite too, Alice. I always feel bad that I steal your your favorite one before you get a chance. But I know my favorite, and one of both of our favorites, is the desert globe mallow. It's just such an interesting plant. And the cool thing about it is it directly interfaces with the native bees of the area. And they have this really cool symbiotic relationship where the bees actually nap within the flower petals of the globe mallow, and they will actually like close up around the little bees to kind of protect them while they're napping.
Oh my
Um, yeah.
gosh. That's
So
such a
really, really, really interesting things. And that was one of the cool things about the project to me, is that I never knew that. It's likely, unless I did a project like this, that I may have never really known that about this specific plant. So just even knowing five plants more personally for me is really interesting, and kind of gives me a different lens on nature when I'm taking a hike or when I'm walking through the city.
Yeah, absolutely.
And for me, I would say the California Everlasting, the story for that is really great. And that story we learned from Parker, who was passing on a Chumash story of the native Chumash community here, who said that the California Everlasting is actually blooming a lot this year
Yeah.
because it is a way of nature taking care of people, because it is actually traditionally used as a respiratory medicine. And so the
Wow.
Chumash kind of, yeah, are
That's
alluding
amazing.
to the COVID situation right now, and how the everlasting is kind of the land's way of, providing extra medicine, which is for naught if we don't see that medicine, if we don't cultivate that relationship, right? And so something that was really interesting at the beginning of when we were trying to do research is that we were actually looking for truly extinct species to feature on the land. And that was really, really tough to look for, to find species, not just in a record of, obituaries of, who's dead around the area, but
Mhm.
it's we really wanted to find their stories as well, and what role did they play in their local habitat, in their communities. Were they, a cornucopia of tools and of resources? Were they, kind of a mothering plant? Were they a home, a shelter like the globe mallow? And were they kind of a mystical being, sort of like the white sage? And it was so hard to find any of that. So we ended up with these five plants, four of which are somewhat somewhat still around, although their habitats have been truly still disturbed. And then one, the beachlaya, is a plant that is going extinct. And then, oh yeah, okay, so I'll just leave it there. And then I have a quote that I want to kind of
Yeah, I mean, just talking to you both about the stories behind some of these plants, I agree with you, Alexander. When you have that deeper meaning and deeper familiarity and that surprising way that you can relate to these plants, and then you go out into nature, it's actually quite incredible how it changes your view on what you're surrounded by and what you notice and how you disregard them and actually have respect for them. I love how you describe them as plant elders, because we should have so much respect for them. And I feel like we take for granted often, because we're in an urban environment, we don't think of it as nature. We think we have to get in a car and then drive, an hour out of the city to really be in nature. But actually, we're surrounded by plants in LA, and I'm glad to hear that 4 of them are still with us. They're often powerless against human intervention. So as you said, they have all been affected and impacted by human activity. But at the same time, they're actually extremely powerful. For example, the first land plants may have actually induced an ice age. Plants are very powerful. And you describe the plants in the project as plant elders, as I mentioned, and you speak about their wisdom. Alice, I don't know if the quote fits in here, but how do you think we as humans can cultivate that wisdom in relation to how we live in urban spaces?
Alex, you have
I think, I was just gonna say, I mean, for me, I think it's just about listening more. I mean, not to sound corny, but like listening to the plants more. There's not many people in LA that are adopting. Well, actually, I guess I should say, everyone that has their homes and their home gardens anywhere in the country, not many people are doing native plants like natural gardens. And it's a really easy thing to do. Like, all you have to do is have a little knowledge about your area and what plants would kind of normally happen there. And you can have a really interesting, like, native plant kind of like nursery in your own home. And it's just like little things like that, to me, just getting a little bit closer to what nature actually wants to do naturally, as opposed to what we as humans naively think is most pretty, aesthetically for like our yard. So for me, it's like small things like that, and just kind of like getting a little bit closer to nature.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting thinking about what we deem to be aesthetic. And yeah, things like the palm tree. Many of the palm trees that we see around the city are not native to the area. They were planted here as a real estate ploy to kind of sell Los Angeles as a certain sort of size of a city, right? And so thinking about, then the aesthetics that nature comes up with that are useful. So, for example, the fact that yellow and purple flowers or plants would grow together to attract pollinators, or the globe mallow showing up the way it does in its particular shade or its particular size is good for the bees. There are all of those relationships, and so if we are just disrupting those relationships, there are a lot of consequences for not just the plants that we see, but the species that are working with those plants. But then if we are able to kind of help, amplify those relationships and plant more milkweed in the yard for monarch butterflies around here, for example, or other plants that are native, then it gives them a little bit more of a chance to, keep going in the environment. And I think about it as like, these individual plants and the way that we have featured them in sort of a way that shows agency for each plant, and a sort of like you are walking up to that plant in the environment, or you're opening it up in your phone, and it's this being, and you're one being, and that's kind of like a level ground for finding a bit of empathy. But to really think about that as one unit of a larger scale of ecological communities, whole communities, and then even bigger, the climate as it is right now, all of that is interlinked, and we are entangled with them. Our fates are entangled with them. And so it's, just as much a way of making home of ourselves and practicing on land that we live on, and as well as respecting indigenous communities and listening to them as well, to, I will say, land back, and listening to them, to see what the land should, how we can work with it and not against it.
So natural, actually, to live in harmony with these plants and respectfully develop around them if that's possible. As I walk down the streets and I see sort of succulents springing from under the pavements, and they're so beautiful, and yet there's a huge market for succulents, and the price you'll pay for what we deem to be aesthetic. And so I think finding the beauty and the purpose in all of these plants in the natural environment and how they should be is really beautiful and should be more of a priority.
So Alex and I had both done a little bit of a pilgrimage drive around the site. So we should mention that each of the plants is situated and contextualized in a particular site that we have chosen that is, representative of urban disturbance. So, for example, the California Everlasting is situated at Discovery Well Park, which is a park commemorating the first oil strike in the area, south and Huntington Beach. And then the Beach Laya, for example, is contextualized in the eroding shores by the LAX airport. And there's kind of an interesting story with that too. So each of the stories is online that listeners can dig deeper into. But through those pilgrimage trips, I think we've also experienced a deeper relationship with these plants and with the city as well, just kind of driving by these urban environments and then pulling up the augmented reality filters against them felt almost like a tool of protest or of reimagination or of remembering. Yeah, and Alex, you too, right, with the sound and kind of meditating on that in a way, getting those nature recordings.
Yeah. I went around to each of the sites, or almost each of the sites, because there's a lot of field recordings in the environment. Like each plant has obviously its own kind of like sound design elements, but there's also a handful of real life kind of field recordings in there that were recorded at each of these sites. So Alice and I visited a few of these sites earlier on. Physically being there and often physically seeing these plants, like especially the black willow on the LA River by the train yard, just kind of like seeing those plants, seeing the area that has been developed, that is there now, and wondering what it used to look like when these plants used to be able to thrive however they saw fit, instead of however we decided they should thrive, is really interesting. And definitely contextualize a lot of the project, even for me. I mean, the project has so many layers, and there's so much history with these plants. There's a lot to learn,
Alice, you had a quote. Can I ask you to read it?
Yeah, so Yewande, when you were mentioning that at the beginning, when you first moved to Los Angeles, that sort of disorientation with it being such a concrete jungle, but then there are these alternative narratives of ecologies. Some of the plants are supposed to be here, others have kind of snuck their way in with human allies. And it's interesting. I mean, so I was thinking about that a lot when I was driving around Los Angeles, installing the augmented reality filters. And one quote that I would always go back to is actually from Arts of Living on a Damaged Planet, and which is a great book. I would highly recommend that as kind of a Bible of the times. And there's this one quote by Karen Barad in one of the essays in there called No Small Matter, and it's talking about the void. So it says, the void, a much valued colonialist apparatus, a crafty and insidious imaginary, a way of offering justification for claims of ownership, and the discovery, and it's got discovery in quotes, of virgin, in quotes, virgin territory, the notion that untended, uncultivated, uncivilized spaces are empty rather than plentiful. has been a well-worn tool used in service of colonialism, racism, capitalism, militarism, imperialism, nationalism, and scientism. The void is not empty, mere lack or absence. The dying is within the living, within the dying. And that, I think, comes to sum up what I have learned in the span of this project and is continuing to learn is practicing this other way of seeing and other way of taking in the environment and the land and the home around us, and seeing these alternative narratives and seeing, this highway and knowing that it is not a void. It is actually, there are these stories and these deaths and, potentiality of life and us as life around it. And just this whole entanglement that we should recognize as a way to figure out how to move forward.
I was going to say, I really like that quote as well, Alice. I was really happy when you showed us that. And I always get the specific image in my head of some kind of, settlers coming onto a land and seeing like an open field of native plants and thinking like, oh my God, look at all this potential. We could put a building here and a garden here. And it's like, no, it's actually already perfect. Please don't, please don't do anything.
Like, it's so profound. Like, oh my goodness. Absolutely.
And the way that we've kind of conceptualized everything, especially in the web-based environment, is to show a certain tension. But as you mentioned, there is also something romantic about the tone of it. I mean, it is not to condemn anyone, and it's not to, put a pedestal on the plants even. It's sort of a way of illustrating the situation of living together.
It is a really nice opportunity to see something that you may not have seen. So it's really not a condemnation. I will agree with that. It actually just it's sort of like, come and see like this alternative way. And then you kind of come to these conclusions yourself rather than being, rather than condemning you. It's just sort of an opportunity to very gently, very beautifully sort of see an alternative and kind of think about things a little bit differently. I mean, the land of Los Angeles was very fitting for this project, given its history and culture. Are there any other lands that you think have a particularly interesting plant history that you'd like to explore next?
I think, this is interesting. I mean, I think in reality, all land is deserving of the stories of their plants being told, for sure. I mean, especially heavily urbanized lands, big cities. Absolutely. So I guess you guys are really going to like this spin. So having said that, I think then it just defaults to like wherever I really want to visit and study, which I would say, I mean, I have a couple of cities I would really like to visit and learn more about their kind of natural habitats and their natural plants. But Alice, did you have anywhere actually like really specifically?
I love that as an answer. And I think that, I mean, in a way, us making this project for where we both live is an invitation for others to also look at their own, especially urban environments, right? And thinking about like, oh, what ghosts and what, plant elders are around here that I should know about, and that I can do my own research on. It is meant to be generative in that way.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. I cannot urge the listeners, if you're listening enough, that you really need to try this experience and try the filters and go onto the website, because it's hard to describe the experience in itself. Could you share where the listeners need to go to experience Rainforest plants? There's a website. There's also the filters on Instagram.
Sure. So the website you can access as 3hd-festival.com/commission/requiem-for-lost-plants. You can also find it just on the 3HD Festival website, on the NAVEL website. And then if you're in Los Angeles, if you're local to the area, you can actually visit them in person. We have augmented reality installations around the 5 locations for each of the plants, and that can be accessible at tinyurl.com/requiem-map. Yeah, and you can find the augmented reality filters on my Instagram at Alice Yuan Zhang. You can also find them through the website.
That's amazing. And I'm going to put all of this on the show notes as well, because it's a lot to remember. Alice and Alexander, it's been such a pleasure having you on the show. I really, really love this project, and it's just been great to get a real insight into sort of how it's come to be and some of the meaning behind behind it. I will let you go.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was really a thrill.
On the show, and have a good start to the year.
Thank you so much.
You. Take care, Yewande.
Take care.
Yeah, nice to talk to you. Okay, talk to you soon.
Up next, my interview with Adrianda. Stay tuned. Adrianda is a sound artist and photographer based in Los Angeles. She creates interactive work, often incorporating living plants and technology in site-specific installations. Ada animates plants with sound, seeking to activate unexpected connections to the natural environment. Ada received her MFA from NYU International Center of Photography and studied at the Slade School of Art in London. Her work has been shown in Los Angeles, New York, Wyoming, London, and Seoul, Korea, as well as Beijing, Shanghai, and Tianjin in China. She's participating organizer of high desert test sites in Joshua Tree, California, and a member of the Southern California Succulent Society. Adrienne, welcome to Sound Science. How are you doing?
Great. Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
I'm so excited to have you on the show because what the listeners don't know is how long we've been trying to make this happen. Right. And it's finally happening. So it's a little bit surreal, as you were saying, but definitely exciting.
Yeah, I'm so glad to be here. I've been listening to your podcast for a while, and it's just so amazing. And I know some of the things you're talking about, but not as in-depthly. And I just learn so much every time I listen. So I'm so happy to now participate in your work.
Oh, that makes me really happy. It's such a pleasure to have you. I'm glad that we're finally getting a chance to chat. First question, if we just jump right in, is this episode is all about plants, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on this episode. So can you describe your art in your own words? What drew you to plants specifically?
I think that as a photographer, that's my background. That's kind of what I entered grad school doing. I was really interested in translation and translation of information. And so I started trying to kind of convert my experience with photography and kind of visual information and the language of imagery, and thought about how we react to sound as well. And so I started basically making these, I would call them like experiments into into these relationships between how external information is created for us, right? Like pictures and music and sound, and all these things. And then how our own sensory perceptions are translating information for us constantly, and how we feel those things and how they communicate, right? So my time in grad school was kind of investigating those processes, and my experiments basically were my artwork, and my observations were my photography, and I kind of tried to see how they intertwined. And so I started playing with sound back in grad school, and that's kind of making sound sculptures and what that meant. And it just kind of turned me on to this progressive world and getting into early 2000s technology. Now I'm dating myself, but it was really, it was very different. It was very, very different. I came from like analog, darkroom. Digital was just coming around, in 2002, 3, 4, and so that's a big part of the evolution of me trying to understand the work that I'm doing, right? The plants came about from kind of all of that background of thinking about living, not living, like what makes something living, like how do we respond to something living? And living in New York City at the time, I think I saw kind of like digital human, like the early 2000s were very full of like cybernetics and like this kind of, half sci-fi human, human futuristic person. And we're all going to be these like really sleek, beautiful computers. But like we took a left turn somewhere, and we're kind of, muddling through it. But in the early 2000s, it was a topic of conversation in grad school for sure. And like, Google kind of only came to be something in like 2004-ish, and everyone was using whatever other software. So I started writing a program using the processing language, and basically took digital photos and turned them into their equivalent sound. So you could like listen to the picture, right? And that was very interesting for me. It took a really long time to really unpack what I was trying to explain. And so now it runs a program that will take in a digital photograph and turn each pixel into a note or a tone, and it will run through the whole picture. So it also turned this photo into like a time-based media. Photos were only like 640 by 480. That was like a large digital image, right? And that would take like 4 minutes to listen to. So it kind of really changed the way I thought about information and how it's stored, and this digital language where everything is so much more laterally exchangeable. Like we used to have to convert units and stuff, but now everything's digital. So, just you can take English and turn it into Chinese, like no problem. It might, and it's funny because it leaves a trace of like a computer, right? Because it's never exactly the same. It's never, the translation is never exactly how the human would say it. And I think that those holes of where the non-human shows up is super interesting.
Given the time at which you started exploring these ideas with audio technology and what's living, what's not living, I think technology is changing at such a fast rate now that it's really interesting to hear the inception of these ideas. And what I find so intriguing about your work is how you combine living plants and audio technology as a way to interpret information that otherwise is quite intangible. And when you're talking about the photography and having, an image and how you translate that into something as an audio, I think that it's really relevant when you're thinking about something that is considered an inanimate object, but in actual fact is very much living. So one of your biggest projects exploring these ideas was Listening Trees of Taos and Plant Sound Listening Stations, which allowed viewers to experience the wonders of the native trees and plants of Taos through sound, which sounds absolutely amazing. And so I was wondering if you could tell me a bit about that project and its inception, and also why Taos?
So I first visited Taos, New Mexico when I was working for the artist Larry Bell, and he lives there part-time and has a studio, and he's also this wonderful, mad scientist, genius artist who I've had the amazing pleasure to learn so much from. And I went there on occasions to be at a studio or for whatever, for work and stuff, and just started, you would go there and you talk to people and they'd be like, oh, we have this event that goes on every year, you should apply. And like that was basically it. So I was in Taos working with Larry, and I learned about the Taos Art and Technology Festival, basically, that happens every year. And so I applied with my work the next year, and that was kind of how it happened. And then what was interesting about my work is that I wanted to use the living plants and these huge 150-year-old trees that are in the plaza and that are really important to kind of the identity of this old plaza and from like the 19th century. But they are also at the same time, coming kind of to the end of their lives as these trees. And it's kind of interesting to think like these people who live there want it to be a monument, but it's really, it's just a tree and it's going to have a life, right? I don't think that we really think about that. I think we think of them as like, I don't know, these monumental kind of sculptural things that aren't alive. And so that's really where I kind of started making my sound sculptures with plants.
And then it seems that you continued working in that direction because your most recent project is at the Brooklyn Botanical Gardens, and that happened last year, and it took place from May to October of 2019. And you received an NEA and a Brooklyn Arts Council grant to do this work. So could you speak a little bit to that project and the difference between your first project in Taos and then now doing something more recently at the Brooklyn Botanical Gardens?
Sure. So the project in Taos was my first kind of large-scale installation of these sound sculptures with living plants that I had done. First, they were kind of in my studio and they were just kind of domestically positioned. And so this is really exciting to do this in Taos. And also it was very, you have to do kind of different steps to kind of learn what you need to do next time. So the one in Taos, it was a lot of people. I actually don't know, maybe 5,000-6,000 people, over the course of a weekend. And I learned how people interact with, the trees and the sculptures themselves and what the reactions are. And it's a very kind of communicative human behavior dance. It's very interesting. I didn't really start there, but to deal with cacti, I think started because they were in a time in like 2012 so positioned as sculptures. And I would have a lot of conversations with people being like, I brought this orchid and I put it, in the sun in the corner and it died. And it was like, yeah, because, like, what do you do? Like, but I wanted it there. It looked good, it looked good on that part of the, area. Or taking like a giant bird of paradise because you like the way it looks, but it really needs like an enormous amount of sun to be happy, and putting it like in your house because like, I don't know, you like the way it looks, right?
Actually just moved my orchid from like this dark corner because I was like, I really wanted it on that shelf and
right.
like it's dying, move it to somewhere else.
Right.
So yeah, I hear you, carry on.
Yeah. So that's kind of what began the work, particularly with the plants, of this like our idea of plants as objects that please us. And so because our relationship with plants and natural environment is so complex and so in depth, we could talk about farming, we could talk about plant medicine, we could talk about anything, right? So I was aware of that and it was too much to encounter. So I just took this small part and I was like, everyone thinks cacti are like rocks and they kind of set them up and they just stand there and they just love the novel shape. And people also like them because they assume that they don't need any care. Like a cactus, you're like, it's just going to sit there. I don't even water it. I don't need it. Can sit on my office desk under fluorescent lights for, 3 years. Doesn't matter. So that kind of relationship is really interesting to me. So that's kind of why I brought cacti and succulent into the forefront instead of kind of dealing with trees or every plant in the universe.
I like what you're saying about them being taken for granted as something that doesn't need a lot of care, that is more sculptural and ornamental, that can just go in your house without really thinking about it. And through bringing sound into your art, it almost acts as like a medium. I mean, you started off as a visual artist and then you became interested in sound. So one thing that I was really keen to ask you is how much engineering goes into your plant sonification work. So in other words, do you create sounds that complement the plant through your own interpretation, or do the plants themselves dictate the sound? And how are they influenced by their environment?
So I do both, but in the case of the project in Taos, people were listening to only the tree and how their movements and touching and, hitting or scratching or whatever it was translated through the tree, and they heard what the tree was feeling. And that is the same principle that, my smaller works have as well, whereas, where the person kind of comes over, this is like one of my sound objects on a pedestal in a gallery, and they kind of won't know what to do and they won't know what to approach it. And then like, they'll have even a plaque that says, "Please touch, but be gentle, plants are alive." And I had someone come over to me and say, "Why does that say don't touch? We know not to touch, it's art." And I was like, it says, "Please touch," right? So that kind of is a perfect example of humans just being like completely assuming information instead of like actually, right? Because the mind just wants to like make things quick and like jump to what's familiar, right?
Oh yeah,
so
it's a complete prediction machine.
Right. So that was very interesting. And then another part of this was, and this is just me observing people interact with it, which was fascinating for me. And they wouldn't know what to do. And someone would eventually, touch it in some way, and they would hear a sound. So there'd be like a feedback, and then they'd be like, "Oh," and then they'd really be interested in it. And then they would start kind of playing it or kind of taking advantage of it and not being as careful because they suddenly got comfortable. And then they would kind of look away and try to call someone over like, "Hey, look what I'm doing." And they would get pricked by the cactus. And then they would suddenly, it was really funny, and suddenly they would be angry at the plant, right? Or at the object. It was just hilarious. And they'd be like, "What? Oh!" So that kind of drove a lot of my subsequent artworks because of this relationship that we have that is, pretty complicated in terms of just caring about it or not, or how it's presented. It changes, the context. And I found that very interesting.
I agree. And I think, at the heart of it, I guess it is about developing empathy with plants, which we've spoken about on the show before, and when we had an episode on mycelium and mushrooms.
Yeah.
And so I think sound is so powerful because it is akin to language in a way, not that they are speaking in their language. They have a way of communicating, but by introducing sound, you're sort of bridging that gap between humans and all of our assumptions and our own agendas and perceptions and expectations to be able to sort of develop a little bit more empathy. And it's interesting that sometimes it backfires. I'm asking for myself here as someone who really struggles to keep their plants alive and wish they would be able to just tell me what they need. So, I mean, I came across some unpublished research from the Tel Aviv University in Israel that found tomato and tobacco plants made sounds at frequencies that humans can't hear when stressed by lack of water or when their stem is cut. So this is unpublished research. And I just wondered, have you experimented with dying plants? You talked about in Taos, like this is a really old tree that is aging, so it's changing. Thinking about dying plants, have you thought about that or what with that idea and what do they sound like?
So I kind of want to go back and answer your previous question, which was about the engineering, and just go over that. So I make sensors that pick up the internal vibrations of the plant when they're touched, either by a human or by wind or whatever it is, an insect, all kinds of things. And so most of the projects are interactive in that way, where you are there to kind of participate in hearing these sounds that are kind of available all the time. But I also create compositions using plant sounds, right? Playing them, touching them, feeling them. But I have some video that accompanies those pieces. But I think it's that picture-sound relationship. They kind of cross over each other all the time. So that's kind of just something that I think is interesting, and it's evolving, and it's how it's presented to the viewer. And then when they go outside and walk down the street and see these plants, all of that kind of works itself into, which was something that happened at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden a lot. It was great because it was located in the front, in the kind of center main hall, where all the visitors entered. So everyone kind of had to mostly go through this area where my sculpture was, and it was a huge 21-foot long sculpture with 21 different plants, audiolized plants to listen to, and you could touch, and there were instructions. And it was really interesting because, of course, then as you walk through the garden, all you see are signs of like, don't touch, don't step on the grass, basically don't interact. And it's kind of be like a plant museum, right? And a lot of the feedback was that it really changed how these visitors walked through the garden, because all of a sudden they were aware that these things have sound, that they make sound, that if you see the wind blowing through them, that sound is happening and frequencies and vibrations are happening that they're not able to hear, right? But any of that movement and energy is felt in the plant.
I think that's so cool because it really kind of gets you to think about how things in our environment respond to us. Usually we're just thinking about ourselves as we move through the world, and the world is just a background for whatever we want to play out. And so just changing that awareness to focus on, okay, I'm here with these living things, and when I interact with them, there is a response, completely changes the dynamic. And then you take that away and then you go out in the world, and I think your perception changes. Maybe it's temporary, but I'm sure that the people who left the exhibition had more awareness as they walked through the city of New York. So I think that's really cool. It's been such a pleasure to have you on the show. If the audience want to check out more of your work, where should they go?
Sure. My website is adriandadar.com, and Instagram is probably my best representation right now of the array of work. And I also have work up on SoundCloud and Vimeo if they want to see some older past work and videos. And I think that's it. I think those are all the sites.
That's awesome. I'm going to continue to follow your work. I'm excited to see what next year brings.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. That's it, folks. For all the show notes, you can go to www.thesoundsciencepodcast.com. The show will be archived on the DubLab website in a few days. And for the podcast version, subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. That's all from me. Have a wonderful week. Until next month.